The sponsor for today's video is Walt's Comic Shop. Stay tuned at the end of the video to find out more. It's a day that seems like any other. You leave your house in search of nothing in particular until out of the corner of your eye, you notice an alley appear out of nowhere. It piques your interest, so you head down the road with only a few splashes of light swathing across the pavement. At the end is an unsuspecting store, squeezed neatly between overgrown plants on the brick walls. While it does seem sketchy at first, something about it draws you in. And before you know it, you've stepped inside. Lined from floor to ceiling are stacks of paper bundles, books, and scraps. Thousands of pages of art and history etched into each. The author's names and origins unknown to either you or the shopkeep. When thinking up the story for the shoujo manga series Children of the Whales, author Abi Umeda came across a journal just like this. One bundle of pages stuck out from the middle of a pile that intrigued her. Written on yellowed parchment paper and bound in twine was a detailed journal of everyday life. One about a boy named Chakuro. One that you can't entirely be sure whether it's fact or fiction. The contents, translated from a foreign language, look to mostly be about his life on an island ship, their harvest, and weather. Until it takes a turn, delving more into his emotions, like he could finally be free to express himself. At least that's what she posits at the end of the first volume of her recently completed dystopian adventure manga. Who knows whether this abandoned journal is based in reality? The original author has been forgotten to time. Their creation only a small piece of the world that they saw, but now left behind. But what once solely existed for them alone has now reached millions in a new form. Even if the dystopian world that we are shown in Umeda's Children of the Whales can't be a true story, after all, it's one of powerful magic and kingdoms, it still gives us insight into the person who first put ink to the page, what kind of life they lived, how they struggled, and what they hoped for. The artist becoming just as important as the work that they've left behind for us. Similar scenarios like Umeda describes can be found all over the world. Artworks created by ordinary people that show us extraordinary worlds. Maybe this artist has already passed on and their art succeeds them, only bringing them fame and recognition after death. Maybe their works gave them small notoriety in their later years, giving a sense of meaning and purpose to their otherwise isolated lives. Whatever the case may be, hundreds of thousands of artists go unnoticed, just scraping by on the fringes. This kind of artwork has become known by scholars as outsider art, a term coined by Roger Cardinal in the 70s, which stemmed from a French phrase, l'art brut, or raw art. This kind of artwork is described as being made outside of the constraints of societal conventions. A key commonality between each of these artists is the self-taught nature of their works and the deep fixation to create, often leading this kind of art to get mischaracterized as being art made by people with mental disorders, which often leads these artists to getting mythicized. The first person of which to destigmatize this kind of art being Jean Dubuffet, who started the art brut movement. One of the most famous examples of an outsider artist is Henry Darger, a Chicago native who was known by his neighbors as having no friends and being cooped up in his tiny apartment where he could be heard talking to himself. After years of living in this apartment alone, Darger was eventually moved to an assisted living facility before his death, and the landlord volunteered to clean up his place for him. After disposing of empty bottles and scraps of newspapers, Darger's landlord discovered 15 massive bound volumes of a 15,000-page plus tax story that Darger had been working on since he moved into that small home. It was a fantasy series that was his life's work, which he called The Story of the Vivian Girls in what is known as the realms of the unreal of the Glandico-Angelinian warstorm caused by the child slave rebellion. This text also came accompanied with hundreds of scrolling, saturated illustrations made from watercolors, scraps, and photo enlargements. Darger had not created this work for any crumb of notoriety. There was no plan to get it published, and in fact, no one even knew he was working on this project until before he died, even shocking those who found it. He was also not trained in any artistic fields either. Most of his childhood was spent being institutionalized in the Illinois Asylum for Children before escaping and spending the rest of his days working as a janitor. Darger was nothing more than an isolated man with a troubled past who used creativity as an outlet for the swirling emotions inside his head, releasing them through the tips of his fingers and the stroke of a brush. In a lot of ways, the outsider artist mirrors our main character Chakro in Children of the Whales. It follows his life on an island stuck in the middle of a sea of sand called the Mud Whale. It's home to a little over 500 residents who are either marked or unmarked. Those who are marked have an ability called thymia, which gives them power heightened by emotions. Left alone, thymia can go uncontrolled, so to combat this, the people on the Mud Whale fold their hands to contain their feelings in times of distress. Chakro is one of the marked, however, he's considered a bit of a problem child due to his hypergraphia, his obsessive desire to write that takes over when his emotions run high. At the heart of this manga is the insurmountable desire to create, almost in a way that can feel obsessive or compulsive. Like, if the words don't come flowing out of you, you'll break. We first see this desire when a former teacher of Chakro passes away at an early age, as all the marked on the Mud Whale are short-lived. While every other character silently closes their eyes and folds their hands together, Chakro openly weeps for his beloved teacher, his need to write down everything growing stronger during this intense moment of sorrow. Chakro even reflects that burning compulsivity to create as that of Henry Darger, both of whom have been shaped by these small, isolated worlds that they grew up in. Darger only having the nuns and children in the institution with him, and Chakro only having a few hundred people on an endless sea of sand who frequently die young. Neither have the means to leave this closed-off world of theirs, only being able to run from it by escaping into their writing. Our lives and our experiences deeply impact the way that we create, and this is no different for Chakro. Every moment of the 15 years of his life on the Mud Whale have shaped his worldview, the cultural practices and religion molding how he deals with trauma and hardships. Due to the views of emotions being a hindrance on the island, Chakro must also leave emotion out of his writing, wanting to remain as an impartial outside observer who just documents the events. Even if while he does so, his tears fall down his cheeks and dampen the pages. There comes a time when Chakro is no longer able to be impartial, though. It arises when one day another island is spotted floating near the Mud Whale. A reconnaissance team is sent to go scope the place out, and Chakro ends up tagging along. He soon discovers a young girl on this island, a sight he's never come across before. Another human who didn't look like anyone else on the Mud Whale. The girl goes to attack Chakro with thymia, but she's stopped by him just before she passes out from exhaustion. Although initially shocked by all of this, Chakro is still amazed that the world might be bigger than they initially thought. Once back on the Mud Whale, it is revealed that the girl called Lycos knows about their origins and the history of their people, one that has been hidden from anyone on this island under the age of 30. The people on the Mud Whale are seen as criminals to the outside world. They've been exiled by the mainland to a prison called Falena for wanting to keep their emotions, with all those on the mainland feeding their emotions to what they call the noose. The people on the mainland believe that emotions are unnecessary and they will lead to the destruction of humanity. This is why Lycos was found near the Mud Whale, as she was meant to execute all of the people on the island for their former crimes. Despite this, Chakro remains steadfast that Lycos is not heartless. The more time she spends away from her island ship's noose, the more she starts to show her emotions again. This gives hope to Chakro that maybe those on the mainland aren't so different from the people on his island. Unfortunately, this revelation comes right before the mainland army arrives to kill everyone on the Mud Whale, leading to the deaths of Chakro's close friend Sammy, the town's mayor, and many more. It was a day that changed everything. When Sammy died in Chakuro's arms, the small bubble of paradise he lived in was shattered. Realizing that once and for all, they weren't alone on this sea of sand, but those that they found wanted them dead. They are a persecuted people for rebelling against the conventions of those on the mainland. It is after the events of this day that Chakuro is no longer able to restrain the feelings that pour from his pen. At the end of chapter 3, Chakuro writes that his official records ended the day before the massacre, and anything afterwards was from his own personal journal. This starts the next chapter with a beautiful description of life on the mud whale, how the sand feels on their skin as the wind picks it up, the sight of the sun radiating off of the mud from the walls of their homes. It instantly becomes more personal. You can grasp the love that Chakuro has for his home in these detailed descriptions of the menial. Much of the art from outsider artists comes from the deep emotional traumas they've experienced throughout their lives. Their art being an innate need to vent the words that they can't say in their public life. Darger unleashed the abuse he faced as a child into the world of the Vivian girls, where the horrors they face in that story can be seen as mirroring his own. Other outsider artists like Tressa Prisby dealt with the continual early losses of her family members and children by building a village made out of colored bottles in her backyard. Ionel Talpazon, who was a desperately poor immigrant who was struggling to live, was able to find solitude by creating elaborate images of UFOs. Chakuro too was able to find sense in the needless deaths of his loved ones by documenting the histories of his people. Each of these outsider artists found an outlet for their struggles in their creativity. Despite having a hard time expressing their feelings plainly, it's abundantly clear how each artist felt just by experiencing their art. The desire to save others, the desire to create a home, or the desire to reach further than your own confines. All of which bleeds into Chakuro's own desires as an outsider artist in his own right. As Daniel Wasczyk puts it, these artists are often marginalized by race, gender, or ethnicity, and disempowered economically and politically. These artists attempt to assert their voices, communicate significant ideas and values, and perhaps change their worlds. Chakuro fits into this exact description, as do many others that live on the mud whale. They are the quintessential outsider. They've been put on an island meant to float endlessly on a sea of sand, disenfranchised and left wandering for decades. They're unsure of when their lives will be snuffed out by the mainland emperor, or why having emotions has led to such deep hatred. Those living on the island are marginalized and face the many traumas and oppressions that marginalized people go through. They witness the destruction of their loved ones on the land that they've made home, despite being displaced. The writing that Chakuro will be leaving behind, the art that he will be creating, will detail the histories of the mud whale. It gives agency to their people, intimately showing the hardships they face while still staying hopeful during adversity. Chakuro's emotional writing shows a deep empathy that runs counterintuitive to the narrative that the mainland has about those on the mud whale. They are seen as devils who will destroy them, but Chakuro's own story never shows an ounce of this. It's these emotions in his writing that help humanize his people to us in the future as the reader. Empathy and emotion come at a price though, especially when dealing with those who lack it. Would it actually be easier for Chakuro and the others to give their emotions to the noose? It could be argued that remaining emotionless would make their suffering easier to endure, not just because their emotions are what persecutes them, but also because it is those emotions that make them feel the suffering tenfold. However, it is their emotions that shape them as people. It has shaped the lives of those on the island into who they are today. If those on the mud whale hadn't kept their emotions, the cultures that they created would never have existed. The act of folding their hands to contain their feelings, sending their dead off to the sea of sand rather than giving them a burial, and the tradition of watching the yearly migration of the Hoshiboshi that lights up the sky. All of these experiences, both good and bad, have molded how Chakro views the world. He sees this island as something worth fighting for and something worth protecting. It has filled him with hope, empathy, and joy. His tendency to write instead of clasping his hands just being his own way of reaching that catharsis. This is the same culture that connected so deeply with Lycos when she first arrived. Even though she was one of the people who was sent to destroy their island, all she needed was to meet them to change her mind. Their emotions are not a danger. In fact, their emotions are what make them such a kind people. It's specifically Chakro empathizing with Lycos that helps her understand this. It makes her realize that she too wants to protect the mud whale. We as the reader are going through Chakro's journals as if we ourselves found them in that sequestered store in the alleyway. Every word written down is conveying the legacy of Chakro and his people on the mud whale. It may be intimately detailing his life on the page, but it's the words chosen and the love conveyed that give us a sense of Chakro as a person, of how he lived on the mud whale, and of how he endured suffering. When all seems lost, Chakro is still creating something tangible for his people and for their future. His writing lets him take back the control of the narrative of who he is. Through his art form of choice, he is able to find solace in the ever-looming destruction that revolves around him. He may write for hours on end and still feel like it's not enough to commemorate the love that he had for his close friend Sammy, but it's still something that he can look back on to remember that Sammy once existed. She was right there, laughing and arguing next to him. Art is just as important to history as the artists themselves. Outsider artists show us a unique viewpoint from the marginalized that we may have never experienced otherwise. Much like how Chakro's life sprawls out on the page, we can feel a connection to him in a much more personal way, which in turn connects us to the mud whale. While outsider artists may not have knowledge of the fundamentals or expensive tools, they create to express themselves, to tell their lives in ways they never could. Artists like Darger, Prisby, and Talpazan were looked down on by those around them. They were seen as outcasts and rejects. However, their art was able to give people a peek into their minds. It made those who once viewed them as strange stop to examine their own biases. The only thing that differentiates them from an eccentric creative is their marginalization. Henry Darger may not have made the Vivian Girls for fame and money, but he did want to leave behind a legacy of his life, whether it was based in reality or not. Chakro has his own desires for this as well. He wants to leave a legacy of the mud whale for all those who will come after him, satisfying both his innate need to create as well as that emotional outlet too. Our lives and our decisions are shaped by our emotions. We pour every ounce of our hearts and souls into whatever we make. No choice is made without an emotion behind it. No artwork is made without a history behind it. Leaving stories behind of either fantasy tales or historical occurrences will show the next generation who we once were on an individual scale. In that regard, Chakro's journals show us just how much each person on the mud whale meant the world to him, how much love and care he has for his people and the future of his home. Thank you to Walt's Comic Shop for sponsoring today's video. Looking for English language manga in the EU? Then Walt's Comic Shop is what you need. They have thousands of manga currently in stock with an inventory that's growing daily. Walt's offers low shipping prices for any EU country with bulletproof packaging and speedy customer support. You can enter the code Colleen's MangaRex at checkout for free shipping on your first order of €40. Get series like Children of the Whales and many more at waltscomicshop.com. dystopian.com, your #1 source for English language manga in Europe.